What if I told you that the most lethal special forces unit in Vietnam never fired their weapons? That 5 men with knives terrorized an entire enemy army for 10 days at a time? That the Pentagon buried the truth about these operations for decades because it was too embarrassing to admit? This is the story they never wanted you to hear. While American forces were dropping more bombs than in all of World War II combined, a small group of Australians discovered something terrifying. They discovered that silence was deadlier than any weapon ever made. And what they did in those jungles, well, let's just say the Viet Cong gave them a name that still sends chills down spines 50 years later. Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. Soldiers would vanish without a trace, no gunfire, no explosions, just gone. Found days later, arranged in ways that violated every cultural norm. The enemy started refusing to patrol certain areas. They spread rumors that these Australians had made pacts with spirits, that they weren't human at all. And here's what makes this even more incredible. The Australian SAS achieved kill ratios that American analysts dismissed as impossible. They ran the numbers again and again. The results never changed. 2 casualties in the entire war during these patrols. 2. While equivalent American units lost 10 times as many men. So why didn't the Pentagon adopt these methods? Why did they classify these findings and pretend they never existed? The answer will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War. Today, we're going deep into the classified history of the silent killing patrols, the boot-cutting rituals, the psychological warfare techniques that broke entire enemy units, the aboriginal tracking methods that gave these men almost supernatural abilities, and the dark truth about what happens when warriors are trained to become something more than human. Stay with me until the end. Because the final revelation about why America really buried this story, that's going to change how you see military history forever. The American Green Beret pressed his back against the tree and watched the 5 Australians move through the jungle like water through cracks in stone. Not a single branch snapped, not a single leaf rustled. The patrol had been moving for 6 hours straight, and the American had not heard a single word spoken aloud. When he accidentally kicked a root, all 5 Australians froze simultaneously, turning their heads toward him with expressions that could curdle milk. One of them raised a single finger to his lips. The message was clear. Make another sound, and you will be left behind. This was 1967, deep in Phuoc Thai province, and the American was learning a lesson that the Pentagon would classify for decades. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment operated under a doctrine so alien to American military thinking that it bordered on the incomprehensible. These men had voluntarily abandoned their greatest technological advantage. They had willingly surrendered their firepower superiority. They had chosen to become ghosts in a war where the United States was dropping more bombs than it had in all of World War II combined. But the American had not yet witnessed the most disturbing part of their methodology. The Australians called it the Silent Killing Patrol. The Viet Cong called it something far more terrifying. They called it Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. And for 10 days at a time, these phantoms would disappear into the green hell of Vietnam without firing a single shot from their rifles. This was not cowardice. This was not caution. This was the most lethal hunting methodology ever devised by a modern military force. And what they did during those 10 days would change everything the American thought he knew about warfare. The doctrine began with a simple mathematical reality that American commanders refused to accept. In the dense triple-canopy jungle of Vietnam, a rifle shot could be heard from over 2 kilometers away. The muzzle flash at night was visible from even further. Every single round fired was a beacon, a signal flare announcing to every enemy within earshot exactly where you were, how many you were, and what direction you were moving. The American approach was to compensate for this with overwhelming firepower. If the enemy knew where you were, you simply called in enough artillery and air support to annihilate everything around you. The Australians looked at this equation and saw something the Americans missed entirely. They saw that firepower created dependency. They saw that noise created vulnerability. They saw that in the jungle, the hunter who made the most noise became the prey. But their solution would shock even the most hardened special operations veterans. And so they made a decision that their American allies found almost impossible to comprehend. They would enter the jungle without firing their weapons. They would hunt human beings with knives, with wire, with their bare hands if necessary. They would become predators so silent that the Viet Cong would not know they existed until their comrades started disappearing one by one. This was not a theory. This was not a training exercise. This was operational doctrine, and it produced results that the Pentagon studied obsessively but never publicly acknowledged. The numbers alone would keep American analysts awake at night for years to come. During the entire Vietnam War, the Australian SAS suffered only 2 men lost in action during their long-range reconnaissance patrols. 2. In the same period, American long-range reconnaissance patrol units suffered casualty rates that were sometimes 10 times higher per capita. The Australian kill ratio, the number of enemy eliminated for each friendly casualty, reached levels that American statisticians initially dismissed as impossible. They ran the numbers again and again. The results remained the same, but the numbers were real, and the secret was silence. However, the statistics only told half the story. The methods behind them were far more disturbing. A typical Australian SAS patrol would insert by helicopter at last light, moving immediately into the jungle canopy before the sound of the rotors had even faded. From that moment forward, the 5-man team entered what they called hard routine. No cooking, no smoking, no talking above a whisper, and even that only in absolute emergencies. Hand signals became their language. Touch became their communication. They would move through the jungle at a pace that would drive American units insane, sometimes covering less than 500 meters in an entire day. But this glacial pace was not inefficiency. It was the methodology of the apex predator. And what happened when they finally found their prey would haunt the Viet Cong for generations. The Australians understood something fundamental about jungle warfare that American doctrine completely missed. In the Vietnamese jungle, speed was the enemy of survival. The man who moved fast made noise. The man who made noise was found. The man who was found was eliminated. The Viet Cong had been fighting in these jungles for decades before the Americans arrived. They knew every trail, every clearing, every likely ambush position. They had informants in every village. They had listening posts throughout the bush. Against such an enemy, the American approach of aggressive patrolling was essentially suicidal. U.S. patrols would crash through the jungle, talking, smoking, stepping on every dry branch in their path. The Viet Cong would hear them coming from hundreds of meters away, set up a perfect L-shaped ambush, and annihilate them before they knew what hit them. But the Australians had devised something that would flip this dynamic completely on its head. They reversed the equation entirely. They became the ambush. A 5-man SAS patrol would find a likely enemy transit route, a trail, a stream crossing, a clearing, and simply disappear into the vegetation beside it. They would lie motionless for hours, sometimes days, covered in cam cream and natural foliage, controlling their breathing, controlling their heartbeats, becoming part of the jungle itself. When enemy soldiers walked past, sometimes close enough to touch, the Australians would not move. They would count them. They would note their weapons, their equipment, their direction of travel. They would let them pass. And then, when the moment was perfect, they would strike. But the killing itself was only the first phase of a much darker operation. The elimination techniques employed by Australian SAS patrols during these silent operations have never been fully documented in any official military publication. What exists are fragments, whispers, court testimony from decades later, and the haunted recollections of men who were there. The preferred method was the sentry takedown. An Australian operator would crawl, sometimes for hours, through vegetation until he was within arm's reach of an enemy soldier. The approach had to be perfect. One snapped twig, one disturbed bird, and the entire mission was compromised. The operator would control his breathing until his heartbeat was barely perceptible. He would wait until the sentry's attention was directed elsewhere. And then, in a movement practiced thousands of times, he would strike. But what came after the strike was what truly broke the enemy's spirit. The Owen gun, the distinctive Australian submachine gun with its top-mounted magazine, was often modified for these operations. Some operators filed down the firing pin and used the weapon purely as a club. Others preferred the F1 bayonet, a blade designed for close-quarter combat. Still others used improvised weapons. Piano wire garrots, weighted kashes, sharpened entrenching tools. The objective was always the same: eliminate the target without producing a single sound that could alert other enemy forces in the area. Yet this was merely the tactical phase. The psychological warfare that followed was far more devastating. The Viet Cong began to notice a pattern that filled them with a dread they could not name. Soldiers on patrol would simply vanish. Not captured, not wounded, just gone. Their bodies would be found days later, arranged in ways that violated every Vietnamese cultural norm about the treatment of the departed. Sometimes the bodies were displayed. Sometimes they were hidden in locations designed to maximize the shock value of discovery. Sometimes personal effects were taken. Not valuable items, but intimate ones. A letter from home. A photograph of family. A Buddhist prayer amulet. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. We were here. We were close enough to touch your men. We could have taken any of you at any time, and you never heard us coming. But the Australians were not finished. They had one more psychological weapon that would prove even more effective. This psychological operation was not accidental. It was doctrine. Australian SAS commanders understood that in a guerrilla war, fear was a weapon more powerful than any rifle. The Viet Cong had used terror tactics against South Vietnamese villages for years. The Australians simply applied the same methodology in reverse, directing it against the guerrillas themselves, and it worked. Viet Cong documents captured after the war revealed that certain units refused to operate in areas where the _3_ had been sighted. Others reported that morale collapsed after patrol members began disappearing without explanation. The fear of an enemy you could not see, could not hear, and could not fight was more demoralizing than any artillery barrage. The Pentagon watched all of this unfold, and what they discovered next would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Vietnam War. The American military establishment observed Australian operations with a mixture of fascination and denial. Special operations liaisons were sent to observe Australian methods. Intelligence officers compiled detailed reports on SAS tactics. Pentagon analysts studied the kill ratios and casualty figures obsessively. But official adoption of Australian techniques never occurred. The reasons were complex, political, and deeply revealing about American military culture. The first problem was philosophical. American military doctrine in Vietnam was built around the concept of attrition, using superior firepower to destroy the enemy faster than he could be replaced. This doctrine required noise. It required explosions. It required body counts that could be reported to Congress and the American public. But there was a second problem that the Pentagon could never publicly admit. Silent patrols that eliminated 3 or 4 enemy soldiers without a single shot fired did not fit into this paradigm. They could not be measured. They could not be quantified. They did not produce the satisfying statistics that military bureaucracies craved. The American approach was industrial warfare. The Australian approach was hunting. And hunting does not scale. The third problem was cultural. American soldiers in Vietnam had been trained to rely on their technological superiority. They had helicopters, artillery, air support, napalm, and more ammunition than any army in human history. Asking them to abandon all of this and crawl through the jungle with a knife was not just tactically difficult. It was psychologically impossible. And yet, the most damning problem was one that would remain classified for decades. If the Pentagon officially acknowledged that Australian methods were superior, it would have to explain why American units were not using them. It would have to justify the billions of dollars spent on ammunition that was being sprayed into the jungle to little effect. It would have to admit that smaller, poorer allies had figured out something that the greatest military power on Earth had missed. And so the Australian methods remained classified, studied, admired in secret, but never officially adopted. But the 10-day patrol cycle itself contained secrets that went even deeper. The 10-day duration was not arbitrary. Australian SAS planners had calculated the maximum period a human being could operate at peak effectiveness without hot food, spoken conversation, or normal sleep patterns. 10 days was the limit. Beyond that, concentration began to slip. Reaction times slowed. The preternatural alertness required for silent jungle operations degraded into exhaustion. But 10 days was also enough time to achieve remarkable results. A single 5-man patrol could cover an operational area of dozens of square kilometers, mapping enemy positions, identifying supply routes, counting troop movements, and eliminating high-value targets when the opportunity presented itself. The intelligence value alone was incalculable. But the real product was something far more valuable than information. The real product was fear. Imagine being a Viet Cong soldier in Phuoc Tuy province during the Australian deployment. You know the jungle. You have grown up in it. You have fought the French in it. You believe you understand every sound, every movement, every sign of danger. And then your comrades start disappearing. Not in firefights. There are no firefights. Just gone. Found days later, arranged in ways that suggest something inhuman was responsible. The stories that spread through Viet Cong units were more terrifying than any American bombing campaign. You start hearing whispers. The Australians are different, the whispers say. They do not fight like the Americans. They do not announce themselves with helicopters and artillery. They simply appear, silent as death. And then they are gone. Some say they have made pacts with jungle spirits. Others say they are not human at all. The rational part of your mind knows this is superstition. But when you are alone on night watch, and the jungle seems to breathe around you, rationality is a thin comfort. This was the true weapon of the Australian SAS, not their rifles, not their knives, their silence. But the boot-cutting ritual revealed an even darker level of psychological sophistication. When an enemy soldier was eliminated silently, the Australian operators would sometimes remove his boots and slice them open with their bayonets. This served two purposes that demonstrate the depth of thinking embedded in these operations. The first was practical. Vietnamese soldiers wore distinctive footwear that left recognizable tracks. By destroying the boots, the Australians ensured that the enemy could not determine which direction the patrol had moved after the encounter. Forensic tracking became impossible. But the second purpose was far more sinister. Boots were precious items in the Viet Cong supply chain. They were more valuable than food, sometimes more valuable than ammunition. A soldier whose boots had been destroyed could not walk. He became a burden on his unit. When other Viet Cong soldiers found their comrade's body with deliberately destroyed footwear, the message was unmistakable. We could have taken anything, but we chose to take something that would hurt you. This attention to psychological detail permeated every aspect of Australian SAS operations. Nothing was accidental. Everything was calculated for maximum impact on enemy morale. The silence was a weapon. The patience was a weapon. Even the things they chose to take from their victims were weapons. And the training that produced these operators was itself shrouded in secrecy. Australian SAS selection was, and remains, one of the most demanding special operations qualification courses in the world. But the Vietnam-era training included elements that have never been fully documented in official sources. The Aboriginal Tracker program was central to this training. Indigenous Australians had been tracking game across the harshest environments on Earth for over 50,000 years. Their techniques, reading disturbances in soil and vegetation, understanding animal behavior as an indicator of human presence, moving through bush without leaving traces, were adapted for military purposes with remarkable effectiveness. But what these operators learned from Aboriginal trackers would give them an advantage that no technology could replicate. Some Australian SAS operators spent months living with Aboriginal communities before deployment to Vietnam. They learned to see the jungle not as an obstacle, but as an information network. Every bent twig was a message. Every disturbance in the leaf litter was a sign. Every change in bird behavior was a warning. By the time these men arrived in Vietnam, they possessed skills that their enemies simply could not match. The Viet Cong were expert jungle fighters. They had been using the bush as their ally for decades. But they had never faced an enemy who could read the jungle as well as they could. The psychological impact of this reversal would prove devastating beyond anything the Australians had anticipated. For the first time, the guerrillas were being out-guerrilled by a foreign force. The hunters had become the hunted. And they had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. But the logistics of maintaining these silent patrols presented challenges that would have defeated any lesser organization. 10 days in the jungle without resupply required meticulous planning. Every gram of equipment had to be justified. Every item had to serve multiple purposes. The patrol members themselves had to be in physical condition that most professional athletes would envy. Water was the critical constraint. In the tropical heat of Vietnam, a man performing strenuous physical activity could require several liters per day. Carrying 10 days' worth of water was impossible. The patrols had to obtain water from the jungle itself, streams, rain catchment, even extracting moisture from certain plants. But water sources were also where the most dangerous encounters occurred. Every drink of water was a calculated risk. Streams and water holes were natural gathering points for enemy forces as well. An Australian patrol approaching a water source had to do so with the same caution they would use approaching an enemy base camp. The dehydration that came from avoiding water for extended periods was sometimes preferable to the risk of encounter. Food was simpler but no less challenging. The Australians developed ration systems that maximized caloric density while minimizing weight and packaging noise. No tins that could rattle. No wrappers that could crinkle. Food was consumed cold, often in the small hours of the morning when enemy activity was lowest. But sleep deprivation was perhaps the most brutal aspect of the silent patrol doctrine. A 5-man patrol could never all sleep at the same time. 2 men were always awake, watching, listening. The others slept in shifts of 2 or 3 hours, often sitting upright against trees to minimize noise during sudden wakening. After 10 days of this routine, the accumulated sleep debt was staggering. But the Australians learned to function in this twilight state, their senses somehow remaining sharp even as their conscious minds operated in a fog of exhaustion. The weapons they carried reflected the unique and disturbing requirements of their mission. The standard Australian military rifle of the era was too long, too heavy, and too loud for extended covert operations. Many patrol members carried cut-down versions of various weapons, optimized for close-quarters combat rather than the longer-range engagements that characterized conventional warfare. The Owen submachine gun, despite its age, remained popular for several reasons. Its top-mounted magazine was less likely to snag on vegetation. Its reliability in muddy, dirty conditions was legendary. And its distinctive silhouette meant that in the chaos of a firefight, friendly forces were less likely to be engaged by mistake. But firearms were always the last resort. The preferred weapons were those that made no sound at all. Knives, of course, but also crossbows, which could eliminate a sentry from a distance without alerting his comrades. Wire garrots that could dispatch a target in seconds without giving him time to cry out. Even sharpened stakes, arranged in patterns designed to injure pursuing enemy soldiers. The medical equipment carried on patrols included items that would raise eyebrows in any conventional military organization. Drugs for forcibly quieting enemy prisoners who might otherwise alert their units. Instruments for rapid field surgery in case a patrol member was injured, and his cries of pain might compromise the mission. But the most dangerous moment of any patrol was not the hunting, it was the extraction. After days of maintaining perfect noise discipline, the patrol had to suddenly announce its presence to friendly aircraft. The helicopters that retrieved the men made enormous amounts of noise. If the enemy had been tracking the patrol, this was the moment when they could attempt to engage. Australian SAS patrols developed elaborate extraction protocols designed to minimize this vulnerability. False extraction points would be established. The actual pickup zone would be selected at the last moment. Patrols would sometimes call in their extraction, and then move several kilometers before the helicopter arrived, using the original extraction call as a decoy to draw enemy forces in the wrong direction. But some patrols faced situations where even these precautions were not enough. When they detected enemy forces moving to interdict their extraction, the Australians would simply disappear back into the jungle and wait. Days of additional silent operation were preferable to walking into an ambush at the pickup zone. This required a level of patience and self-discipline that most military organizations could not instill in their soldiers. The helicopter pilots who supported these extractions were themselves a remarkable breed. Flying into potentially hostile landing zones to retrieve 5 exhausted men from a patch of jungle that looked identical to every other patch of jungle required skill, courage, and a profound trust in the ground teams. The American Special Operations Forces who witnessed these operations often emerged permanently changed. One Navy SEAL who was attached to an Australian patrol in 1968 later wrote that he felt like a child who had been pretending to be a soldier his whole life, only to suddenly meet actual warriors. Another American operator described watching an Australian tracker read the jungle the way a scholar reads a book, finding meaning in bent grass, disturbed soil, and patterns of insect activity that were invisible to the American eye. But not all Americans adapted well to Australian methods. The psychological demands were extreme. 10 days without speaking, 10 days without hot food, 10 days of controlling every bodily function to minimize noise and scent. Some American liaison officers could not complete even a single patrol. They requested extraction after only a few days, unable to cope with the mental strain. Others completed their attachments but emerged changed, haunted by what they had witnessed and participated in. The transformation worked both ways, of course. Australian operators who spent extended time with American units often expressed frustration at what they perceived as tactical carelessness. One Australian sergeant major was quoted as saying that accompanying an American patrol through the jungle was like trying to hunt deer while leading a brass band. The cultural gap between the two forces was profound, and it never fully closed during the war. But the legacy of the silent patrols would extend far beyond Vietnam in ways that remain partially classified to this day. When the Australian SAS returned home, they brought with them a doctrine that would influence special operations thinking worldwide. The emphasis on stealth over firepower, the integration of indigenous tracking techniques, the understanding that psychological warfare was inseparable from physical combat. These concepts would eventually find their way into special operations training programs across the Western world. But the full truth about what happened in those jungles remains partially hidden even today. Official histories gloss over the more controversial aspects of SAS operations. Veterans who participated in the silent patrols are often reluctant to discuss specific incidents. And the war crimes questions that emerged decades later cast a long shadow over this remarkable tactical achievement. Some of the same techniques that were celebrated as evidence of tactical brilliance, the elimination of sentries, the psychological manipulation of enemy morale, the operational flexibility that prioritized mission success over procedural compliance, were later cited as evidence of a culture that had drifted too far from civilized norms of warfare. This is a difficult truth that must be confronted honestly. The methods that made the Australian SAS so effective in Vietnam existed in a gray zone between legitimate military operations and violations of the laws of armed conflict. But the fundamental question remained: why did it work when nothing else did? The answer lies in understanding the fundamental nature of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong were not a conventional military force. They could not be defeated by destroying their infrastructure, because they had minimal infrastructure. They could not be defeated by capturing their territory, because they did not hold territory in the conventional sense. They could not be defeated by eliminating their soldiers faster than they could be replaced, because the entire population of North Vietnam was their replacement pool. The only way to defeat such an enemy was to break their will. And will is not broken by explosions. Will is broken by fear. Will is broken by uncertainty. Will is broken by the creeping, persistent terror that comes from facing an enemy who seems to violate the natural order of things. The American approach created martyrs. The Australian approach created nightmares. Every village bombed was a recruitment poster for the Viet Cong. Every civilian casualty was a family with new reasons to hate the foreign invaders. But the silent patrols created something different. They created doubt. They created confusion. They created the specific kind of fear that erodes fighting spirit from within. When you do not know if the man next to you will simply vanish in the night, when you cannot trust the silence of the jungle, when every shadow might contain a ghost with a knife, that is when morale begins to collapse. And in Vietnam, among those who remember, the name Ma Rung still carries weight half a century later. Today, the veterans of those patrols are elderly men, if they are alive at all. Most never spoke publicly about what they did in the jungles of Vietnam. The official records remain partially sealed. The full scope of Australian SAS operations during the conflict may never be known. But the enemy remembers. Vietnamese histories of the war contain references to the Ma Rung that are striking in their consistency. The jungle ghosts. The spirits that took men in the night without sound or warning. The Australians who did not fight like other soldiers, who seemed to be something other than human. For a small force from a small country, This was perhaps the ultimate validation. They had achieved something that billions of dollars and millions of tons of bombs could not achieve. They had become legend. The silence was their weapon. And in the end, the silence spoke louder than any gun. The guns stayed silent. And the silence was more terrible than any bombardment. This was the secret weapon of the Australian SAS. This was the truth that the Pentagon could not bring itself to acknowledge. This was the answer to the question that haunted American commanders throughout the war. How do you defeat an enemy who knows the jungle better than you do? You become something the jungle has never seen before. You become the ghost. You become the silence itself. And you never, ever fire your weapon.